to the stream. Today, I'm very excited to have with me Dr. Danielle Guizzo, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics in the University of Bristol. Hi, Danny. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you. So your research covers quite a lot of different things, all of which I'm really interested in, and all of which I hope we cover today. I've got a little list in front of me, so you can tell me if it's accurate and what I'm missing. But so you basically study kind of power and expertise, with special reference to the economics profession in particular, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You also study teaching, pedagogy, pluralism and heterodox economics, how to introduce these things into economics education. And on top of that, you're also a macroeconomist, right? That's kind of your background in terms of your specialization within economics, right? So you look at the broader economic trends, inequality, growth, inflation, and so on. So is that a complete list?
It is. Should I say something about it? It is
Yeah,
kind of
please.
an extensive list, and then it's like things here and there. But I think that's how we academics, we kind of find our own way. So I can tell you a little bit about my story. So when I decided to go to uni, economics wasn't my first choice. I was in between history and translation studies. So nothing to do really with economics.
Wow.
But I had one of my cousins, he was doing an economics degree. And we were talking about some stuff that I was studying at high school at the time. And he was like, well, I can give you a couple of books, stuff that we do in economics, and then you can take a look and see if that interests you. And then he gave me 2 books on economic history and 1 economics textbook, but it was more on history of economic thought. And when I actually started reading those things, I was like, this is what I want to do. Because it's history, but it's much more, I don't want to say applied, but I think it gives us a better understanding of the world with more tools. And I thought at the time that it would be a bit more practical in the sense that it would give me more job options. So I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. So my initial interest was actually economic history, development, and macro. So this is what I really, really enjoyed in the beginning of my degree, this relationship between macro development and history. And in my second year, I had the opportunity to do some research assistantship with one of my lecturers. And she was a historian and philosopher of economics. So she was the one that introduced me to Foucault and more like classical political economy, like deep history of economic thought. And actually, when I started actually reading Foucault, it was like, then everything made sense. Then I was really interested in history of economic thought and then developing those ideas. And then I kind of left aside the macro development part and went more into history of economic thought. So I consider myself, like you've mentioned, macro. I think I'm more an interest person, like an interested person in macro rather than a macroeconomist per se. But I think all falls under this umbrella of history and philosophy of economics, because we can explore not just how ideas evolve and what are the consequences and impacts of those ideas, but I really like to take a critical stance into economics to really understand what we do and how that impacts the world. So I think that's what I like to do. And that relates to the things that I do in education as well. It is really to understand what economists do, how economics exists as a discipline and how it maintains itself as a discipline, and how the way that economists think, how did that actually can affect the world and impacts an ordinary person in our everyday life. So in a nutshell, this is how I would put everything together.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's all unified under the banner of kind of understanding economic expertise what good it is, which I think is the title of the stream, if I remember correctly, and what purpose it serves and what purpose it has served historically, right? And I guess it's interesting that you came into this through history because you're from Brazil, right?
Yes.
And in Brazil and Latin America more generally, the role of economists in policy, right, and in shaping the economy and in serving the role of experts is possibly the most salient, for want of a better word. It's the clearest in the world, I think, in Latin America. Economists have had more influence than anywhere.
Mhm. It's true. It's true. I think that comes as a product of so many things. So in Latin America, as I remember quoting one of my favorite economists, who's Fernando Cardim de Carvalho. So he was a post-Keynesian. And he said, well, like, if you come from Latin America and you study economics, it's impossible for you to believe in equilibrium. Like, you look outside through the window, equilibrium doesn't exist. And he said, like, if you live in Switzerland, maybe equilibrium exists. But if you study economics and you are in Latin America, it's impossible for you to believe in equilibrium. So you have to develop other tools and you have to bring other concepts from other disciplines. You study a lot of history, you study a lot of institutional economics. In my case, I studied Brazilian economics, so it's this mix between history, macro, and development, like dependency theory, structuralism. So I think this gives us, I don't want to say a better, I don't want to make a judgment of value, but I think it gives us a broader perspective of how things work. And I think it gives us a wider range of tools to understand how things work. So, because in Latin America, I think economists, especially those that work in policy, it's way more challenging to pursue good economic policy because you have so many constraints. So I think you have to have a wider variety of tools. And I think this is why economists in Latin America have this impact and this challenge. And I really admire those that really want to do this and take that stance, because it's quite unstable. So many things can happen. So many things are not under your control. You're under a lot of pressure from the public, from the media, from elites. So yeah, I think, economics in Latin America is a different version from what I see here in the UK or in the US, for instance, in terms of teaching and research and academia and policy discussions as well. I think that they're a bit different. So, but the problem is what happens in the global South. Normally, they try to emulate whatever people in the UK, US do. So, but I think we can discuss that later.
Yeah, absolutely, we will. I'm interested in, I guess, how, because when I think about economics in Latin America, I think about the history of like the 1960s and 70s, actually. Sorry, the 1970s and 80s is what I meant to say there. And for me, that's obviously a very neoliberal era, right? It's a very neoliberal type of economics, an extreme free market version of economics, where economists were enlisted to kind of, implement these policies, often within actual dictatorships, right? But what you're telling me is that these days you feel like there's a bit of a broader and more holistic understanding of economics in Latin America. So, like, how has that happened? Is that true? How has it changed, since the 70s and 80s?
Okay, good, very good question. I think it's a combination of things. So I think what happened, that's my view, at least from what I can tell about it. So I think what happened in the 80s in Latin America, or at least I can give like the example of Brazil and Mexico or Argentina that suffered the most. I think the ways that these economies, they went into a crisis and they defaulted and they had to seek financial help. I think the implementing neoliberalism and implementing certain ideas and this neoliberal playbook that they had to follow, I don't think that those ideas came from Latin America. I think it was more implemented and requested that they had to follow this. Like, think Washington Consensus, think shrinking the size of the state, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and all of that. So you see that there's a big shift on how these economies had to deal with their structures, with their institutions, with their mode of thought. Because one thing that I can tell, so for instance, in Brazil, we had, looking into the history of how Brazil has developed, so I would say from the 50s until the 70s, even though you had a dictatorship from the mid-60s until the end of the 80s, this dictatorship was not something that we can call liberal at all. It was very much state-driven. You had state-owned enterprises, state had a heavy hand. There was a lot of intervention. And even when you think about things like education, because normally universities and teachers, they are considered to be evil, right? In that case, they weren't. Even though the military government hated left-wing people, there was this sort of tolerance towards universities and towards teachers because they saw education as a way to develop. So it is a very interesting relationship when we think about this idea of interventions and the state intervening in the economy compared to what happened in the 1980s when they had to follow this sort of guide and playbook coming from the Washington Consensus, where everything related to that had to change. You have to reduce the size of the state. You have to make sure that you open the markets, you reduce trade barriers. You want to make sure that these economies, they develop their financial markets. So that's where I think that sort of mindset, more, let's say, a more liberal mindset, started to populate Latin America. And there are some economists in Latin America that do believe in that quite firmly. But I think this is more of a recent history.
Okay. So, I mean, you mentioned, so there's like a battle, right, between, I guess, what you could very loosely call like lefty type economics and neoliberal type economics, which is probably a bit of a glib way of summarizing it. But I was interested because you mentioned dependency theory and structuralism, and I feel like quite a lot of people listening may not know what those are. So could you just sort of explain those a little bit and where they fit into this whole debate about basically it's about how to grow and develop economies like Latin American economies, which are poorer than economies in the West, right?
That's right. So I mentioned the dependency theory. So in the 50s, so after the Second World War, you see the rise of international institutions. So IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. There's a more prominent role of the United Nations. And these institutions, particularly the World Bank and the United Nations, they started to set up specific commissions to focus on development and economic growth in the Western world. So in the case of the United Nations, they set up a commission, which is called the Economic Commission for the Latin American and the Caribbean. So this was set up, I think, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, to study how Latin America could push for economic growth. So at that time, just a little brackets, growth and development were seen as pretty much the same thing. So they set up this commission to study growth and development in Latin America. And it became a permanent thing. So up to today, we have ECLAC, this economic commission. And there were many Latin American economists that were part of this initial setup, this commission. So like Raul Prebisch from Argentina, Celso Furtado from Brazil. And the way that they started to develop these ideas became known as dependency theory. So they developed their own scholarship, their own school of thought, which tries to understand how Latin America is being able to experience economic growth. So if you look into the raw GDP data, Latin America was doing very well. If you look into the 40s and 50s, Latin America was really taking off. But it was still underdeveloped. So their theory was, okay, there is a dependency relationship here where we can see economic growth, but there is no development. And this relates to the structural condition that Latin America was into. So this relates to its history, colonialism. Latin America was always a region where it had a peripheral role in the world economy. So they assumed that you have the core countries, so Europe, so the Western Europe, United States, and then you have the peripheral countries. And they have a very specific role because they supply, let's say, agricultural goods or goods that have very low value added. And this causes a problem for these economies. So they're always in a very dependent relationship to whatever happens in the core. So their main theory was underdevelopment is not a phase. It's actually a permanent condition. So unless we don't change the structures, so at that time, this was seen as being able to industrialize itself, being able to add more value to your production of goods, being able to set up a stronger welfare state to support more social policy. So if they didn't do this, Latin America would be in a dependent condition forever. So this is what they actually started to do. And this became a huge local school of thought. It became a huge intellectual group. It exists until today. And it went through phases. So the originals are from the 50s. Then in the 60s, they changed a little bit their agenda. Then in the 80s, and so on. But they exist until today, and they're very influential in whatever happens in Latin America in terms of economic policy.
Great, yeah. So it kind of goes back to, colonialism, right? Even because the Portuguese, for example, when they're established, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on the history here, but there were things like many of the roads would be built, just to go from the ports to the gold mines, right? So you're talking about structure. This is what we mean by like a structure, right? You've got like a whole economy that's just geared towards basically getting raw resources out and into the richer economies, and that's the type of thing that persists. But I suppose one thing, we're kind of going more down the dependency theory route than I expected, but I'm interested in it. So but one thing that maybe not clear, it seems kind of intuitive, right? But it might not be clear to everyone, is what is actually the problem with exporting raw materials versus other goods? Like, I mean, it might not be clear to a mainstream economist, right? At least, right? Because they'll be like, well, it's just your comparative advantage, right? You're just exporting what you've got, what you're good at, and then you're importing, cars and Germany are good at producing those. So what's the problem?
That's a very good question. So thinking about how these dependency theorists elaborated on it, they said, okay, comparative advantage. So they took two main theories that they criticized. So it was comparative advantage and the solo growth model. So the idea that you just increase your stock of savings and then this is going to lead to economic growth. So they said, okay, for Latin America, this is pretty hard to do, even though there might be a comparative advantage because, okay, it's very rich in natural resources. There is no limit on land. So it's a very rich region. But the problem is, so Raoul Preber said, okay, the problem is it's very low value added. So you have a deterioration of the terms of trade, to put it in a more jargon way. Because he said, okay, if we see any crisis, any volatility, any shocks in the economy, certain economies that are just export-led and just export commodities or have this dependency on low value-added goods, they become very volatile and become very vulnerable to external shocks. So they are not able to actually control whatever happens in their economy. So the way that they saw as a way to solve this was to develop their own industry. So to be able to develop their own internal markets, to develop their own, so to bring the idea of infant industry, to bring let's say some trade barriers to be able to develop other industries, other sectors. Because otherwise, according to these economists, Latin America would just rely on this forever.
So
and then
how,
it wouldn't be able to develop other markets.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how successful were they, at least in the short term, in establishing these greater value-added industries which weren't as vulnerable to shocks?
Good question. As a good economist, I would say it depends. I think that they were partially successful because there was, like I said, you have to look into the political, social context of that time. So most of these countries, they had heavy hand from the government, or they were just starting to engage in dictatorships. And most of these countries, they had like a national plan, a national development plan. So they had this idea of developing infrastructure, heavy state spending on infrastructure, protecting their economies towards developing certain technologies or developing their own industries was on their agenda as well. So there was some reliance on that. At the same time that they knew that they still relied on they still relied on agricultural goods. Okay, we're going to develop and ensure this is still, let's say, an important sector. But parallel to that, so we're going to take that surplus that comes from export-led agricultural sector, and then we're going to reinvest that in developing our own technology, in developing our own industries, in financing infrastructure. So they were able to do that for a while. The problem is that basically ends in the 1980s when we see the oil crashes, and then these economies, they all go into default, and then they cannot do that anymore.
And then what happened?
Well, I guess the rest is history, because in the 90s, so the 1980s in Latin America is known as the lost decade. So these economies were just trying to really stabilize it themselves and try to come up of the hole that they were when they defaulted. The 1990s was the decade that we call the stabilization decade. So some of these economies, they were experiencing hyperinflation or very high inflation. Some of those, like in the case of Brazil, you had an important role in terms of monetary policy. So implementing a new currency, implementing inflation targeting, so to try to use other tools to control the economy. Then, let's say the past 20 years, I think it's a mixed bag. You have some good years of good economic growth, everything's flourishing. Some of these economies, they relied on consumption-based growth, so very strong internal consumption markets, like the case of Brazil, like the case of Mexico, and they did that very well for a few years. But the problem is, at least in my view, it is very hard for Latin America to be able to catch up. So not with Europe or the US anymore, but with China and Asia. So Latin America really needs to find out how it's going to not to be able to put itself in a dependent condition and to be able to develop its own things and ideas and policies. So I think it's a real challenge. It's not easy for sure. I don't have the solution.
No, that's completely reasonable. So I mean, I'm interested in to what extent economists influenced all of these developments, right? Because there's an argument that kind of, I guess you could call it a Marxist argument, although Marxists might get angry at me for throwing that term around so casually. But like, there's an argument that it's all kind of determined by the material forces, right? So you were talking about things like Dutch disease, we call it, when you've got too many raw materials. You were talking about defaulting and debt, and those things obviously played a role. But I think what one thing that you're an expert in is the role of expertise, and the role of like economic expertise in particular in driving policies and in history. So what role did that play in the story that you just told?
Oh, wow. good question. So how we understand expertise, I'm going to mention like two sides of the story. So normally, so people that study this, they are sociologists of disciplines. So they study how these ideas influence practice and to what extent economists are able to just dictate and say whatever they want or not. So there are some, let's say, different views to that. So one view is whatever economists say, this is going to affect practice. Policymakers are just going to pick that up and implement. Done. That's a more simplistic view, right? So we know that in practice, this changes a lot, and it's not really like that. We have so many examples with COVID and the pandemic when experts said, we cannot let people out, or we have to implement certain restrictive measures. And then the government said, yeah, we don't care about that. So that role of expertise, so not necessarily experts have that much power in certain occasions. There is another approach, which I think it explains things a little bit better, which is called, this comes from Peter Ho, it's the marketplace for ideas. So we have many different experts. So in the case, economists, we have many different economists that have different views, different prescriptions, different recommendations. And then depending on the situation and depending on the public demands and public pressure, policymakers are going to pick certain things up. So there's like a pool of economists and ideas, and then they are picked up by policymakers as they go along. Once that's picked up, then it goes to the process where economists are able to liaise and have some sort of influencing power. So they can, depending if it relates to more technical advice, that's also one of the things that these scholars say. Well, when it's more technical, normally experts have more independence and more power to push for certain things. When it's more, let's say, sensitive topic or more political or more heated debates, then experts have less power. So once they are in and they are able to push for certain things, then policymakers are willing to hear and are able to, let's say, make that happen. So they are actually able to implement certain policies. So going back to the question that you asked me about Latin America, I think that helps us to understand at least part of the picture, because I think that there's sort of, I don't want to say agreement, but there was some sort of conversation between the this national development plan or project that governments had at that time to make Latin America great again, to make these countries grow and flourish and develop. So they had that project in mind. And economists had the toolkit. So they had certain ideas, they knew how to do it, or they were able to advise on certain areas on how this could be done. So I think that there is an interesting relationship there. So I think economists had some power, especially because this is a product of the Second World War. The Second World War is a turning point for economics as a discipline, as experts, as economists, and how people see economists. So it is with the Second World War that we have this idea of the economist, the man, white, old man in a suit with a chart offering neutral advice. So this is a historical product. This is an imagery that's very recent. It has roughly 80 years old. And at that time, this was very much in fashion. So I think governments really respected economists, and they had this project, and then they brought important economists to be able to advise on how to do this sort of project.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you said about the role of economists and how they're often recruited when things are perceived as technical, because it feels like to me over the course of the 20th century there was an emergence of the economy as an idea, right, and as a kind of technical field, and something which had to basically be governed and managed by experts, right? Something which was, akin to a machine, so expertise would be useful. So what you've seen, in a sense, is this dynamic relationship where economists are advising on technical matters, but they also end up turning what were previously political questions into purely technical questions, and thereby expanding their remit, right?
Absolutely. My view on this, I might be wrong, but my view on this is that there's also an important change. So I mentioned the Second World War. I think that's important to understand this role of the economist and the imagery. But I also think that there's an important change if you look into the history of science. So what we conceive to be as truth, what we conceive to be as rigor, what we conceive to be neutral. So I think economists they did a good job, not saying that I agree with that, but they did a very successful job in taking those political questions and being able to neutralize them with the technical language and push for certain agendas. I don't think economic knowledge is neutral, even though it can be very technical and mathematical and very jargon heavy. Deep down, it's impossible to be neutral. So I think economists did a very good job. We have to acknowledge that. They did a very good job in taking political questions and being able to neutralize them and, wash the ideology away and then present it in a very neutral way. So Mary Morgan, who's a historian of economics, she has a paper with Donald Rutherford in the 90s where they said, well, take ISLM, which is a very basic model which shows the equilibrium between the goods market and the money market. They said, well, if you show that there's an equilibrium here and there and how policy should be done, this sounds way more harmless than just to say it as a narrative that may sound very ideological, that the government has to intervene more in the economy.
Yeah, it's a really good example, and it's interesting. I mean, another example would be something you mentioned at the beginning, right, which is like development versus growth. Because one thing economists have been extremely successful at doing is making GDP growth the aim of basically the global economy. It seems to be almost every economy. Whereas you were saying, in between the 40s and the 60s in Latin America, the dependency theorists, or what would become known as dependency theorists, were saying, well, actually, we're seeing growth, but we're not seeing development in a broader sense. So there's a difference between the two, and it's not neutral for you to say, let's focus on GDP growth, because then you're privileging one aim over another. But I want to go back to what you said about ISLM. So just for everybody's purpose, people are arguing about cobalt in my chat. So everybody, ISLM looks a lot like a demand-supply diagram. It's like it's a cross, and it's like a macroeconomic diagram. Yes, exactly. Thank you. So it's like, it's for, it basically is a version of Keynesianism that justifies government spending. And it, basically what Danny's saying is that putting it in those technocratic terms is perhaps more palatable to certain people, especially policymakers, because it sounds neutral, versus just saying, and everybody who especially lives in the USA will know about this, versus saying, we want the government to spend more money, we want the government to employ people, we want the government to do this, do that, etc. So that kind of technocratic language has really found a niche, didn't it, in policy? And it's interesting because we were talking about neoliberalism, right? And we'll probably get onto like free market economics in a bit. But when economics first emerged as extremely influential, when economic expertise first became influential, it was very Keynesian, wasn't it? And it was very interventionist. So could you talk us through maybe that history a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So we talked about ISLM. So this is, let's say, sort of introductory economics. When you go in macro, like you said, is a sort of open supply demand. So you have an equilibrium in the goods market. So it represents consumption, investment, and the equilibrium with savings, government spending on one side, and then on the other side you have the money market, so interest rates, money supply, money demand. And then that will give you an equilibrium with an equilibrium interest rate and an equilibrium output. So you can play around a little bit and then see whatever happens with output and interest rate. So this is known to be as Keynesian. I'm sure most of you have heard about Keynesianism before, Keynes. Oh, this is very Keynesian. Keynes means, intervening more in the economy. But this is a combination of things. So what became Keynesian in the 50s and 60s, so this is the golden age of capitalism, is basically Keynesian. So between the end of the Second World War up until the end of the 1970s was the Keynesian era. This is not, it doesn't take a lot from the original Keynes, but this was more an interpretation of some of Keynes's ideas. And this was
some people
popular.
Get very angry about whether it's correct or not, right?
Exactly. So this was super
including
popular
me,
in
for the record.
Yeah. Well, I have my own criticisms to Keynesianism and myself, by the way. But it became this, let's say, hybrid between some of Keynes's ideas. So things like, I can drop the jargon, like sticky wages would be one, incomplete contracts, or things like that. The role of the government in the economy, so spending, active fiscal policy.
Imperfections and things like that, right? Ways that the market isn't perfect.
Exactly. And those ideas were taken by certain economists like Paul Samuelson, Alvin Hansen, Franco Modigliani, and these people became known as the neoclassical Keynesians, or the neoclassical synthesis. So a rereading of Keynes's original ideas. So if you actually take Keynes's original work, it's not Keynesian. It's specific. It has its own ideas, little to, only a few mathematical equations here and there, but this was taken and put it into a more neoclassical framework. And this became the benchmark for macro, at least for economics in the 50s and 60s. And it was super popular also for one important reason. Paul Samuelson was the guy that wrote the first economics textbook. So this was the economics degree at that time was a neoclassical synthesis. So you would train new economists with those ideas as well.
Yeah, and it was, for a long time, it was just a case of that whole framework justified why governments intervened in the economy to ensure full employment, effectively, for quite a long time, at least in the West. So one thing you draw on quite a lot. I want to get more into economic expertise, and I know that you use Foucault, who you mentioned before. Yeah. Now, I was just wondering, so he had a view of economics, right, and of economic liberalism, and he talked about the interplay between like markets and states. And expertise. So I was just wondering if you could maybe first explain Foucault to those of us who have no idea about him, but also just like how you think he's relevant to this to economic expertise.
Okay. Well, first of all, for those that heard Foucault's name, please do not leave. This is interesting stuff. I promise it's interesting, because I know that I have to make that disclaimer. If I say Foucault, I know half of people will leave. So it is, Foucault is super interesting. He's more well known in sexuality studies, people that do education studies and psychology and history of medicine. Now there's a big movement in Foucault in sociology as well. So some people call him a political philosopher, some people call him a social theorist. But he has some, like part of his work really focused on economics, mostly history of economic thought. So Foucault has a few ideas. he always was very interested in the relationship between knowledge, power, and truth. So Foucault started to explore the history of psychiatry and the history of medicine. And then he saw that some of the ideas that we see in social medicine and in the history of psychiatry were actually social practices. So they were mostly formed on power relations and how the experts understood the truth and how they implemented that and they pushed for that. So Foucault said, okay, we have a social conception of what we think is truth. On any discipline, on any body of knowledge, on everything that we see in reality, okay, we have certain truths. And then for us to be able to reach those truths, we acquire knowledge. So he said, that's why we feel so anxious when we don't know something. And then we go study it. We go to acquire that knowledge because knowledge will give us the truth. But Foucault says, okay, that process of creating those truths, so context, we're talking about post-structuralism, postmodernism, 1960s, 1970s, complex French philosophy. It's all socially constructed. So he's more interested in finding out what constitutes that truth, how society creates certain truths. And then he says, okay, we build that truth and we do that via knowledge. But what maintains a truth to be considered truth is power. So experts have power. We are on the ivory tower. We are considered superior beings. We are very knowledgeable. We have a certain status in society, and we want to hold what we think is truth. Because if we hold that truth, it means that we are also powerful. So he explored that in several disciplines, mostly in the social sciences. And he has some interest in understanding what happens in economics as well. So in the case of economics, he really focuses on, let's say, classical liberalism. So he goes from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, a little bit on Marx, and then he gives this big he skips mostly of the, let's say, mid-20th century, and then he goes into the late 1970s, where he sees that something is happening with the Chicago school. So he sees the birth of neoliberalism there. He looks into the Ordo liberals, so the German version, soft version of neoliberalism, to put it in a nutshell, the American version of neoliberalism. And then he says, okay, there's something going on here which is becoming very, very popular. So he looks into those ideas and how economists created truths, especially with regards to the role of the market. But what I think is so interesting about Foucault, if I'm talking too much, feel free to...
No, please, it's super interesting.
But what Foucault says about economics, and especially liberalism, which I think is so cool, is he says, okay, we have to take economic ideas as actually practices. Because when they actually reach policymaking, when they become recommendations and when they affect people's lives, they become practices. So we actually take that and they become what what he calls a governmentality. It becomes a technique of government. So it's going to really shape how we behave and how we conceive certain things in civil society, within economic relations and outside economic relations. So he gives a few examples of how that works. So in the case of neoliberalism, he says, well, neoliberal scholars were very successful in defending the idea of the market. Okay, so the market is the best form of social organization. It comes from nature. It doesn't have an ideology. It's natural. So the market is this superior form. It has its own forces of supply and demand, regulated through the mechanism of price. Okay, so we take that. And the way that this is going to work is it's not just going to affect economic relations, but we take that and we incorporate as our own ways of existence. So it has its own, let's say, life, which actually also governs how we behave and how we do certain things that do not relate to the economy at all. that's where the expression of the entrepreneur of the self comes through. So we take the mechanism of the market, we take this mechanism of that we conceive from economics into other things, into how we behave with other people, into how we look for a job, into how we deal with our personal relationships, how we take care of ourselves in terms of our health, how we plan the future, how we deal with education. So the idea of human capital, investing in your own education so you have higher returns in the future. So Foucault was very interested in this relationship with economic ideas, how they affect policy and how they affect the everyday life.
It's interesting how pervasive those ideas are, right? So you mentioned human capital, and I think, you know, the idea of education as an investment in yourself is really, really common, even among people. They might not use the term human capital, right? But that's probably the primary way we view education these days, right? As an investment in yourself, and basically as a vehicle to higher earnings. And so I guess, I mean, it seems like, you know, Foucault, what Foucault is kind of noticing, at least my impression, is that it's, you know, it's one thing to advise policy, right, and have an influence over policy, but it's quite something else when you basically change people's worldview, even kind of, you know, members of the public. And I mean, it's like Margaret Thatcher said, right? She said, economics is the means, the goal is to change the soul, or something like that, right? So that's exactly what Foucault's interested in, right?
Exactly. So what we see in policy, so what we see happening in practice when it comes through policy, that's what I call, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's when the idea is actually implemented and then it's going to be pushed by somebody. But underneath that, there's a whole framework that already, let's say, promote this idea to be able to, you know, to flourish and develop itself. And it also creates broader mindset. So taking the idea of human capital. So if we look into the history of education, the history of universities were mostly public until, let's say in the UK, until the 1980s. Why? So at least in the 20th century, they were seen as a way, okay, you want to educate the population, but you also want to train the labor force, right? You want to create professional jobs, you want to train the labor force because there are demands and society needs those professional positions. So there is a societal benefit to have those professions, and everybody's going to benefit from that. We're going to benefit from medical doctors, from lawyers, from engineers, from whatever we can train. With Thatcher, so this framework started there in the 1980s with the neoliberal mindset. And I mean, the crystallization of that really ended up with Tony Blair and the idea of popularizing the university degree, which was, okay, of course, we want to train people. Yeah, we know that there's a societal benefit, but the individual benefit, which mainly come through earnings. So if you get a degree, you're going to get a higher salary, and that's your individual benefit. That's much higher than what you're going to contribute to society. So therefore, you have to make your own investment in order to get that return. And that mantra is now repeated throughout. So the UK, started that together with the US, and now it's everywhere. It's very hard for you to find a country where higher education is 100% free and public, because there is that idea that you're investing in yourself and you're going to get paid a higher salary. So you have your own individual return, so you have to make a contribution for it.
I think one of the interesting things about Foucault in particular, again, the little that I know, is that he kind of had, despite obviously, he's pretty lefty. I mean, he's a left-wing bogeyman, right? He's the type of thing when, you get people like Jordan Peterson saying postmodernism. What they actually mean is post-structuralism, and that is Foucault, right? Foucault and Derrida as well. So he is kind of a bit of a very left-wing guy. But if you read what he said about neoliberalism and neoliberals, he had this kind of weird reverence for it, didn't he? He had seemed to have this respect. How effectively they had changed people's worldviews, right? So there's, I don't know if you've looked at the stuff with on Foucault and Gary Becker. Because so for everybody, Gary Becker was like the most mainstream economist you'll find, and he was the one who basically invented what's called economic imperialism. So it's like, let's not just do economics of buying stuff and working, let's do the economics of like the family, let's apply the same models to crime, you know, and all of these basically sociological things. And Foucault just seemed to have this like massive level of respect for Gary Becker. So he was quite fascinated by how effective this was, right?
I think the word fascinated is what defines this, because there's, as everything in academia and life, there's no consensus. There's always going to be different points of view. So some people say, okay, actually Foucault was a neoliberal. He loved the markets. He loved neoliberalism. He defended it. So some people will say that. I have a more, let's say, balanced approach to it, because when you actually read Foucault and read like throughout his work, so you start in the late 60s, then you go into the 70s. So Foucault because he studied a lot the history of psychiatry and medicine and social medicine and biopolitics. So this idea that you have to make sure that individuals are well and happy and healthy and taken care of and very docile and controlled, with a framework of what we call the normal person. So Foucault said, okay, this comes from a very heavy intervention from the state and the traditional institutions of medicine. So they conceive that imagery of the normal, docile, desirable person. When Foucault goes to economics and he explores how these economists like Gary Becker, like Milton Friedman, like Hayek, they deal with this topic, and how they emphasize the role of the market and how the market can be a way for us to understand social relations, he says, okay, well, actually, there's something very interesting here, because the way that we govern and control ourselves and the way that we deal with ourselves and what is conceived to be normal or not normal under this neoliberal framework is quite different from that old traditional, old-fashioned model. So I think that he saw on neoliberalism a different way for us to understand that relationship of controlling, of social control, and how we rule and govern ourselves. So in a nutshell, trying to avoid all the Foucauldian jargon, I think that's what he saw with neoliberalism. Because when you bring the principle of the market, so for instance, Gary Becker on marriage and divorce, you get divorced or you get married depending if the sum of incomes are higher combined. If they're not, then you divorce. So you get married and you get together. If the sum of your incomes is higher, then what if, and your future earnings, then what if you were separated? So bringing that principle is a very different way of thinking and ruling of behaviors. So I think he was quite fascinated by that. And I mean, Foucault, they have to put that into perspective into his own life. I mean, Foucault was a homosexual in the 1960s, suffered a lot of issues. He was put into a mental institution for a while because of that, because he was considered to be abnormal and different. So, of course, he's going to look into something where there is a different conception of freedom and liberty and how it's governed by other principles. And, of course, he's going to be fascinated by that.
I mean, you mentioned the family example, and one of the things that came through this when I was reading about it in preparation for this, it was that, I mean, I've said before, libertarians are just like lazy Marxists, in the sense that what they do is they kind of describe all the worst aspects of capitalism, but then they're like, and that's the way it is. Instead of saying like, and therefore, you know, let's move away from this system as a Marxist would, right? So I think one of the things that I read, which actually kind of challenged me at the time, because I always think of Gary Becker's theories as basically being wrong. But something like the idea that like people marry for money, and especially historically that, you know, women have needed to marry for financial security, there's actually quite an uncomfortable truth in that, isn't there? Right? So Gary Becker's theories might sometimes be more true than we'd like to admit. And I suppose that's kind of what Foucault might be getting at implicitly. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so feminist economists, for instance, they heavily criticize Gary Becker's interpretation because, as you rightly mentioned, so he had many theories on the economics of crime, economics of discrimination. So for discrimination, that's the classic example that I like to use on the class to show, okay, see how they think. This is quite questionable, because he says, okay, discrimination is going to be solved with the market. So firms that do not want to hire, let's say, a non-white person, they're going to have to pay higher wages to hire the people that they favor, and then they're going to eventually exit the market and go bankrupt because they're not going to survive with competition. So the principle of the market is going to solve discrimination. The same thing goes for the division of labor in the household. So economics of the household was also developed by Gary Becker. And he says, okay, there might be this, let's say, biological and natural division of labor. The woman stays doing the household work, and the man goes to work outside in the market because that has certain outcomes and benefits, up to the point where maybe something may change, and then these roles might not be the same. But in principle, there's always this division of labor that exists within the household, mostly governed by biological endowments and the principle of the market to some certain extent. So, I mean, I think that is fascinating to think about how he understands that, but also fascinating to use it as an example for us to criticize it so heavily, because those sorts of ideas, even though they may seem so wrong and we might actually be laughing at them now, they influence so many policies and academia and the creation of, let's say, economic research. So I think that's quite worrying, to be honest.
So yeah, so you I mean, you mentioned the role of these ideas in you actually use the term social control. Right. Now, one of your papers, your paper on Foucault and expertise in economics, you discuss the idea of like liberalized markets, this idea of the free market, right? And you talk about how it actually historically, and I think this is 19th century, correct me if I'm wrong, it went hand in hand with population control, right? So this kind of idea of free markets does seem to be, you know, wrong. And it doesn't seem to be necessarily free in practice. So could you maybe talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes from Foucault. So Foucault tried to explore, okay, how this idea of the market became so popular in economics. So before that, Foucault was trying to understand the evolution of the state and how governments sort of create power and how they promote social control. So Foucault said, okay, first we see an important transition in the 16th and mid 17th century, where we don't see the wealth of a country as just a territory, but we see it also as its population. So here we see it's almost that moment where we see the transition from mercantilism into classical political economy. So mercantilism was very much about the national opulence. You want to make sure that, you know, you have very strong national states, the role of the king, the role of the state, very heavy. But it's not just about the territory. So they start to pay attention that population also represents wealth. It's also an asset for the national state. So Foucault says that, okay, first we have the transition from territory to population. So if population is so important for us to be able to maintain our national power, then we have to take care of this population, and we want to make sure that they just don't die. So Foucault says the idea of live and let die disappears. And now we start to take care of the population. So this is where we see the birth of social medicine. So we start to think about, so in the UK, in England, there was the birth of the poor laws. So you want to make sure that people don't starve to death. So you give them some sort of minimum provision, but at the same time, you also want to incentivize them to work. There is the idea of public health. So there are some institutions that start to come up with that, and it's all focused on the population. And Foucault says, okay, these are instruments of social control, right? You want to make sure that the population is well and happy and healthy and working and producing and doing whatever we want to do within those limits. Now, when we think about the role of the market and think about liberalism and how classical political economists, most people take like Adam Smith, for instance. Well, Adam Smith said, well, it is not about the role of the state intervening in the economy, but we have to just let it go, right? It's the invisible hand. If the brewer, the butcher, and the baker did their own business and defended their own interests, well, that's just great. We just leave the market. We don't need that instrument of social control. Well, what Foucault says is, okay, that may apply to certain examples, right? Put into context. Okay, that may apply to Smith's critique to mercantilism and that heavy hand of the state, fine. But that doesn't mean that we have freedom. So liberalism and the idea of the market as the main principle of social organization are very different from freedom and individual liberty. Because Foucault says, for us to be able to actually also implement those mechanisms, so to implement and defend the role of the market as ideal, for us to be able to bring the liberal principles, for us to be able to do all of that, we need mechanisms to control this as well. So liberty and freedom, for they to be able to exist, we also need mechanisms of control to ensure that they're going to work well. Otherwise, we're just going to create, social unrest. So liberty and control, so the idea of freedom and control, they walk hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other, because you allow some freedom and some do whatever you want to do, defend your own self-interest, but within certain limits.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. That makes a lot of sense, and I suppose it relates to. The question is, right, to what degree is it necessary, versus, to what degree do we think that social control is actually something that we don't want to see? And we were talking about Latin America, right, in the 1980s, and obviously, there free market economics went in hand with quite extreme political and social control, and dictatorships and authoritarian dictatorships, right? So I think that kind of shows the contradiction, right? The contradiction between the rhetoric of free markets and the actual reality.
Absolutely. I mean, take the example of Chile. That's probably the most well-known.
Yeah.
It was the window of the Chicago Boys, the perfect example of how neoliberalism was so successful, right? So to give people some context, so the Chilean government, they requested a formal, let's say, guidance from the Chicago Boys, so from Milton Friedman and the economists from the University of Chicago, to give them a guidance to economic policy and to make important changes on social structures. So Chile was the perfect example of, okay, you have, it's the neoliberal window. You are implementing neoliberalism on its fullest. No labor legislation, no workers' rights. Everything is privatized, health, education, pensions. But at the same time, you are under a dictatorship. You have very limited freedoms. Individual freedoms were very constrained. Abortion was illegal. Being a homosexual was illegal. Many people flew the country. To think differently, right? To criticize the government or to have a more non-right-wing mode of thought was considered to be illegal. So that shows how much for us to be able to implement certain ideas, regardless of what they are, if they're more free market, pro-market, or against the market, you have to have mechanisms of control to be able to implement that effectively.
Yeah, and I mean, it speaks to I think the real danger of expertise, right, which is that expertise allows you to think that you're kind of above politics, that you've got the correct technical answers, and, you know, that even, I mean, to an extent that you've got the right values, right? Because I think a lot of the Chicago boys, as they were called, would have argued, apart from the fact that their policies needed to be implemented for reasons of economic efficiency, that they were implementing freedom, in a sense, right? Their policies represented freedom, but it's such a it's such a blatant contradiction to me to implement freedom through an authoritarian dictatorship, right? So I mean, it makes no sense. But that's the problem when you drink your own Kool-Aid, right? And you subscribe to your own ideas too vehemently. Which brings us seamlessly, I have to say, on to like the idea of basically monism in economics, right, versus pluralism, and so this is like a big debate, and this is something that you've written on as well, especially with respect to economics education, because right now we have an economics discipline which has basically a core set of methods and won't necessarily listen to other perspectives. You've mentioned dependency theory, post-Keynesianism as well, and it's very rigid, right? So that's the type of situation we see today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When you were talking, I could not stop but thinking about this idea of thinking like an economist. So we have the imagery. Remember, for people that are still paying attention, remember I talked about the imagery of the economist, the white old man in a suit giving very neutral advice and very technical, jargon-heavy economics. That still stands. So in economics, we have a mantra called thinking like an economist. A great example of that. So if you take a very famous textbook by Mankiw, chapter 1 is called How Economists Think. And then he gives like 10 points on thinking like an economist. Probably the first or the second one were, well, economists normally take the idea of the market as the best form of social organization. And still, that is conceived to be neutral and technical. But deep down, when you actually dig a little bit, you can see that it still relies on a certain form of worldview and ideology. Not necessarily ideologies are bad. We all have our ideologies. But I think it's more worrying for you to sell an idea as being neutral when it's not. So bringing that into pluralism and monism, I think that really coincides because, I mean, as people know in the channel here, I mean, economics has been under scrutiny for so long, at least since 2008. I mean, it was before, but nobody was actually paying attention. But since 2008, we have been under the spotlight. Some things have changed. So the idea of pluralism, well, okay, now people acknowledge that it is important for you to be a bit more open-minded and bring some ideas and concepts. Maybe mention, dependency theory. Oh, there's this or there's that. But then I question, and maybe I'm guiding the conversation now. I'm sorry for that. But has things really changed? Then I'm a bit more skeptical on that. That's why we have to unlearn economics.
Yeah, honestly. Well, exactly. I mean, this is the thing, right? It's a bit, with Mankiw in particular, that like this is how economists think. I mean, it's a bit like being indoctrinated into a cult, to be honest, and that sounds extreme, but I don't think it is, because you're just saying, all right, come and learn to think how we think, and it's like, well, aren't I supposed to be like learning to think for myself about the economy? And that doesn't seem to be the aim when we're training future economists. It seems to be the case that there's a set of tools, there's a rigid set of tools, they get those, they learn to think like an economist, and then they go out and they apply those, as we've said, kind of free from, or hopefully free from political constraints. So you said, yeah, you're skeptical there's progress. So I think we'll get on to that. I think so, but could you let's be positive for a second. Could you maybe give us an idea of how you would like to see economics taught? You know, how you think about teaching economics, and how you think we could improve on what we do now.
Oh, that's a good question. I like that question. So, I mean, if I had the power, I don't think I have, but if I had the power to make economics way more interesting, so I've been teaching economics even though I look very young, I have been teaching economics formally for at least 10 years. And I was a teaching assistant before. And I always saw students, they come in, especially in the first year, they come in and then I ask them, like usually the first week or second week, why have you chosen economics? And that small talk when you introduce yourself. Most people say, well, because I think economics gives us a very good view, like a very good worldview, and we actually understand the world. It is this combination of history and geography and mathematics and politics and sociology and science and philosophy. So I want to understand the world. Or some people say, well, it relates more a bit like bringing on the mix, finance. And then, okay, great. But then you can see after a few years that they are in the process, how they have been indoctrinated into that framework that you called the thinking like an economist. So if I could really choose how we could teach economics in a different way, or what we would teach. So some people think some people say that I'm very critical to mathematics. I am critical to mathematics, but I don't think we have to throw it away as a whole. I think it has an important usage. It has its own usefulness, like statistics, like complexity economics, like even micro, which
even micro.
I think it has its own importance, but we have to reframe that. So if I had to unlearn economics and do it again, I think that I would start with more like history. So like, let's say history, economic history, history of capitalism, history of economic systems, because I think it's important for students to understand that the stuff that we see is historically produced. It's not just the truth, right? This is historically produced. I think, development. So like I had Brazilian economics, which was development, macro, and history applied to my context. I think this should be on every curriculum. I think this is very important. And then to be honest, I mean, you can have some methods. I would like to see some, could be research methods, or however you would call both quantitative and qualitative. So students can have a take on different methods. And what I would like to see, an ideal world would be, you would have an array of options and streams, because I think it's impossible for you to be able to study. Here in the UK, you have a 3-year degree, full-time 3 years. I think that's too little.
Yes.
So if you could have streams, and then students could specialize on whatever they find more interesting, maybe this could be one option. Just to maybe give a disclaimer, I don't have the solution for this, and I often think how I would envision. I think this could be potentially a good idea.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're talking about sounds like what I sometimes call inductive teaching versus deductive teaching. So deductive is kind of like you get with economic theory now, where you start with a bunch of assumptions or axioms, and then you work out the theory, and then if you're lucky, you might go and apply it to something in the real world towards the end of the class. Or if you're unlucky, you might not at all. It might stay entirely abstract. But inductive would be exactly what you said, right? So starting with history and looking at how things evolved. You could start with, statistics, maybe. You could start... I mean, one thing like I always think would be a good thing for economic students to do, which they bizarrely don't do, is just like calculate GDP. Just go into the national accounts, learn how is GDP calculated. I'm gonna throw it out there. Most economics students don't understand how GDP is calculated, and yet, like I said earlier, it's our central economic measure. They don't get their hands dirty with data. They don't study, history. They don't speak to people. They don't go to businesses. They probably don't know how businesses operate. They probably don't know anything about like corporate law, the law in general, property law, all of these things where before I started studying economics, I would have been like, well, that's what economics is, right?
You should do,
yeah, because it's about the economy. They're really absent. So that kind of inductive learning, starting with these like real world problems, real world data of one kind or another, quantitative, qualitative, and history, I think is really refreshing. I mean, I think one thing about history as well is it does, like you said, it shows you how contingent things are, right? Because it's like, I mean, at a very basic level, Robert Heilbroner, I think, once said that the best kept secret of economics is that it's the study of capitalism. The word capitalism isn't mentioned. And if you study history, you realize like, well, there were like thousands and thousands of years before we had our current economic system. So it gives you a critical perspective on the current economic system, right?
Absolutely. I always remember, I'm just gonna say a few things about my degree that I had in Brazil. It was a 5-year degree. It was, it's part-time. So either you study in the morning or in the evening, 5 years. You have a bunch of modules, of courses. You go through a lot. So what you've mentioned about calculating GDP, we had that. We called social accounting or national accounting. We had that for a semester. History of monetary economics, we had that. We had history of capitalism. So you had Carl Polanyi, Duncan Foley, and Giovanni Arrighi in a semester. So you would read the 3 books and understanding capitalism and systems and the Industrial Revolution. So, and plus all the quantitative normal econometrics, 1, 2, and 3, statistics, mathematics, the usual research methods, both quants and quali, philosophy. So you would have like the core curriculum where you would have like the compulsory courses that you would have to take, and then you have a bunch of options that you could take. Like some people that I know that were my colleagues that wanted to go into banking and finance, then they took courses that were more on that area. I wanted to be an academic and I loved what I did, so I wanted to go more into the philosophy and history, and that's what I did. You could take a few courses in other departments. So some people did politics or law or sociology. So I think that's the way to go. But it's a shame that some people only think that economists do macro econometrics, and that's it.
That sounds like a really good curriculum, a good education that you had. That sounded really interesting. Let's contrast that. So I read your paper about economics education, and I've got a couple of quotes that I wrote down, and I actually, if you people follow me on Twitter, I already tweeted them out. So number 1, Thomas Sargent won the Nobel Prize in 2011, Labour/macroeconomist, if I remember correctly. And apparently, according to the interviewee who was taught by Sargent, he said, Sargent would write down equations and say, this is the economy. I am not going to talk to you about how this is the economy, why this is the economy, in what sense this is the economy, but I am very happy to help you with the mathematics, with multiplying matrices, so on and so forth. There was also another quote, and I forget who it was. I didn't actually write it down, but just it said it was something along the lines of, economics is the study of how prices affect behavior. If you don't think prices affect behavior, then get out, go and do sociology or something. What do you make of those quotes, Danny?
Can I not respond to that? No, I'm joking. So this came up from a project that my co-authors and we interviewed a few leading economists that we conceived them to be, let's say, pluralist or in some cases heterodox. And we asked them a bunch of questions, including their practice towards teaching, how they were taught, the good and the bad examples that they had. So, like you said, one of the interviewees, she was taught by Thomas Sargent, and he said exactly that. So it's not about how is this the economy, why is the economy, so what actually is it? It's not. It's literally about formalizing it with equations. So, and when she said that, I like immediately you would think, okay, we're doomed. Economists don't know anything. How formalizing this in equations is going to help with reducing poverty, helping people that are starving out there. So
yeah, and sometimes I find with the maths, I mean, sometimes I find maths useful, but other times you find the insight actually that you get from the maths extremely trivial. You know, like I don't know, for example, like I don't know, we work through these extremely complicated models, and it's like at the end it's like, well, if you live far away from a job, then you're gonna want a higher wage to move. And it's like, well, why did you
isn't
go
that
through
obvious?
like 10 pages of maths to tell me that? You know, I could have told you that. And you get, you know, there's some insights which are more than that, but often the maths does seem kind of trivial. And so we're so focused on method. And like I said, kind of it plays the role of like indoctrinating people, I think, because it becomes a prison, right? The mathematics, I think, when you only learn that and you can't think any other way. And you find that with people. I mean, this is unlearning economics, right? Like you said earlier, this is what I find with people. Half of them don't want to think any other way anyway. So you've got absolutely no hope. So you just ignore those people. But the ones who do, they want to, but they can't because they're only thinking in terms of this maths that they've spent 80% of their education doing.
It's true. I'm not saying maths per se it's evil. Let's just cut all the maths
No.
and throw it away. No, it can gives us some good insights. It helps. I think maths in economics are very helpful for you to organize your thoughts and to assume certain things or to understand certain behaviors or rules. So like, okay, causality. So what's going to happen if I do this? Like for instance, like in macro, one of the things that it's so popular among macro people is like you calculate the optimal tax policy, optimal taxation. So like, okay, it gives you go through the model, you assume a bunch of things, okay, and it gives you this number. So if we implement it in policy, this is how much we should tax people, assuming that the economy functions like this. Okay, it has its own value, right? It gives us some good insights. But I think the problem is only doing this is a problem. So sometimes I talk to certain students that I have met more recently or in the past, and then they said, oh, I really like, let's say, applied economics. It's so plural. You talk about so many things. So you talk about, like, say, you cover something on more macro, then you talk about firm behavior, then you talk about rationality, then you talk about, I don't know, intra-household decision making. And then I ask, okay, that's great. Like you're covering so many topics. Is there a paper that is, let's say, mixed method or qualitative? They all go, no, they're all quantitative because that's how it should be. Which is okay in part. It can be quantitative, it can, but not necessarily that should be the norm. So it gives you good insights in a certain worldview. Like you get the data, yes, but quantitative data is only going to show you a part of the world. So you're looking out there with a certain lens. It's not going to show you whatever else is around. And it is important to understand how this works, yes, but not just that. There's so much more out there that economists should do. Learn from history, learn from qualitative data, learn from law, learn from politics, that it's really ignored.
So, I mean, a good example of the limits of quant quantitative analysis, I always struggle saying that, is GDP again, right? So we mentioned GDP. And if you study GDP, one of the things you get is the ability to calculate GDP statistics, which is very useful and helpful and work with data. But another thing you get, I think automatically, is a bit of a critical perspective, because you realize, firstly, some of the fudges that go into it, but secondly, some of the things that it really misses, right? And so you mentioned feminist economics earlier, household work, household labor, sometimes called the work done primarily by women, raising children, cooking, cleaning, travel and transportation as well, not remunerated, so therefore not in GDP, but it is labor, it is work, and it does produce things, right? So it's like an easy example is like, if you bake a cake and sell it, then it goes into GDP. But if you bake a cake for your family and you all eat it, then it doesn't go into GDP. But it's, it could be the same cake, right? So if we're worried about how much is being produced and consumed, then we might want to think about that. The environment is another example. But there are these things that quantitative measures miss. So I mean, we're pluralists, right? Like, in the sense of economics education, right? So it means quant and qual. It means dependency theory and neoclassical economics. So let me ask you a question, and you mentioned interdisciplinary stuff as well. Yeah. How the hell do you get all of that into a curriculum? Is that not just really unwieldy and confusing?
Well, we are learning economics, so I think it's okay for us to maybe remove a few things, or maybe make them as optional.
Which things do you want to remove? I'm really interested in that.
So for instance, I think that there is a lot of emphasis on econometrics, which can be useful. But I think if you learn some of it, and then if you want to specialize on it, then you choose that. But I don't think everything in econometrics should be compulsory. So for instance,
interesting.
Or let's say advanced micro or advanced macro. Like, I think it's important for you to get a flavor of certain subdisciplines and certain fields, and also with some interdisciplinary courses. So in my degree, I had a bit of philosophy, a bit of sociology, a bit of law. It's just an introduction. And then
was this a 4-year degree as well, by the way, out of interest?
Yeah, it was a 5-year. Yeah, it was
a 5-year degree. Okay, yeah. So yeah, 3 years again in the UK, or actually I should say in England, because Scotland have 4-year degrees. The USA have 4-year degrees. Brazil has 5-year degrees. So in England, as always, we are somehow behind everybody, and we've got 3-year degrees. But that's not enough to learn all this stuff, right?
It's true. And then you have very short semesters as well. So normally in the UK is roughly 10, 11 weeks. In other places, I think in the US is the same. In Brazil, it's 15, 16 weeks. So you have way more time to explore certain things in more detail.
I mean, university is just an excuse for 18-year-olds to get drunk in England. That does have to be said, and slack off over summer. Yeah, that is the unfortunate truth.
I don't know how they survive after 3 years. How do they finish as adults and then they are so
well? They don't really. Yeah, I think is the answer. But sorry, anyway, carry on. I interrupted.
No, I was going to say, I think the problem with the UK is very assessment focused. Like from the beginning of the term, you have to focus on assessing and getting the marks and grading students and everything. It's all about performance. It's all about measurement. I think that's quite problematic. Of course, you want to make sure that students know things, but I don't think that focusing so heavily on assessments is going to help. My impression is that this is the UK system, the educational system as a whole. School level seems to be quite assessment focused.
I think I did the best part of 20 exams in my last year of A-levels in high school. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I got very tired of exams in the middle of my degree. And to top it all off as well, now I mark them. And I can tell you that I don't really enjoy that any more than I enjoyed taking them. So lecturers don't like it because they have to mark loads, and it's actually an extremely unrewarding job. And students don't like it because it puts a lot of pressure on them, and also the whole process is kind of arbitrary, especially with something like an essay. Attaching to a number to it is ridiculous in my opinion. So it's a system that seems only basically to benefit bureaucrats in the government who are determining where to direct funding, or league tables? I mean, I don't really know who it benefits, to be honest with you. Foucault might have some answers, I guess.
Well, yeah, some Foucauldian scholars call that the quantification system. You want to rank, you want to quantify, and you want to put this sort of order, because you want to be able to select the best. And the way that you do this is by increasing metrics, putting a metric and then putting a number and then ranking them. Like in some countries, you do it by concept, right? So you would have, like, let's say you partially fulfilled the learning outcomes, you've excelled. So like you can attach certain concepts to it, which are not necessarily a number. And I think that would generate, at least for students, it would give them a more high quality feedback, not just some random number that you would attach to it. So like at university level, you would have the degree calculations and the marks. And then what makes a difference between a 62 and a 65? So it's okay. It's a bit arbitrary. Why?
My mood on the day I was marking, probably, like, things like that. I think, just like the mood of the marker, who was marking it, all of these things can just affect the mark. And like, nobody admits it because it would just reveal that the whole thing's a bit of a facade, right?
Exactly. And it kind of kills you very slowly as a teacher, as an educator, because you want students to learn because they find it interesting and because you want to engage in a great discussion. And once you have to focus so much on assessment, I think that becomes a problem. Assessment is just a consequence when you're actually going to discuss with students and see if they learned something, if they actually took something from it, if they were able to, whatever they have to do. So this is the instrumental education. Are they mastering a certain concept? Are they able to calculate and multiply the matrices that we were talking about? Are they able to run regressions? Are they able to master this model? Are they able to discuss whatever Adam Smith said in the 18th century? So that should be the end of it as a consequence. And then that's kind of a journey where students are going to build that knowledge, reflect on it, discuss, and then they show that they learned something. Whereas in this system is the deductive teaching that you were talking about. The deductive pedagogy, it's the other way around. You start with assessment. From the beginning of the term, everybody's stressed out. I am stressed out. My students are stressed out because they all want to know how are they going to get the best possible mark, make sure that they get a top first-class degree because they want to get a better job. So it's, yeah. I don't have the answer. I'm just ranting now.
They're not learning. It's a much needed rant. I think, to be honest, about the system. And I think one of the interesting things about economics in particular is that there's been this kind of unholy alliance between the internal dynamics of economics, which we've discussed, right, mathematization, and the increase in student numbers and the increasing focus on grades and metrics, right? So what you have is, because in economics, as it's currently taught, neoclassical economics, it's very mathematical, it's quite easy to assess students on that, right? It makes sense to have a number for maths, right? I said it doesn't make sense for an essay, it does for maths, because you get a certain amount of marks for what you get right. That makes sense. But, and then, so we've seen an expansion of that. That makes universities more able to deal with higher student numbers. They get more people disproportionately into economics. Economics is often a bit of a money spinner for universities. It cross-subsidizes other social sciences, so it's good for the universities. And yeah, you just end up with this kind of whole dynamic where that type of economics is selected not only for intellectual reasons, because economists think that maths is good, but also for like kind of strategic reasons by the university. It makes them a lot of money to have students in there and to be able to assess them and say, look how great our students are.
I think you're 100% right. There is this intrinsic relationship between our educational system, how economics is, and the not the educational system as UK the institutions, but how we teach students, the mode of everything reinforces each other. Absolutely.
So thinking more about how we would improve this system. So some people have brought this up. So firstly, you were saying, I actually forgot to say, when you were talking about things you get rid of. I do think one thing I would get rid of is like the repetition. If anyone's done an economics degree, you do like expected utility theory and like oligopoly theory, like several times. Each year it's just slightly more mathematically complicated, but it's basically the same thing. So it's just this drilling in the same thing over and over again. So I think you could eliminate the repetition, and maybe, some of the theories don't need to be taught at all, but at the very least they can only be taught once, and then we make room for other things. But one thing I want to ask you about economics education is, as pluralists, right? What do we do when practically, we're no longer dictators, giving our ideal curriculum. Practically, when we're teaching, what do we do when we've got to teach some mainstream economics or majority mainstream economics? Because there are kind of, do you sort of teach it and say and pretend that you like it? Because that seems intellectually incredible and obviously would lead to bad outcomes if students actually believe in these really watered down neoclassical ideas. Do you do that, or do you teach it and then say, oh well, by the way, I think this is a load of crap? Because that's also not very good pedagogically, is it? Because the students would just be like, well, why did you just make me sit through that if you think it's a load of nonsense? So we end up in this bind. I don't know. How do you manage it?
Yeah, so I've been teaching quite a while, and I've tried all of those things. So the best solution that I could find was, depending how much time I have to teach something. So assuming I'm going to teach, let's say, introductory macro for a semester, for a term. So I normally start the first week, I give students a good overview of history of economic thought for macro. So we have groups of economists that think in a certain way, in different ways. And what we're going to see are economists that think in a way. So this is how they see reality. It is applicable to certain contexts, to certain conditions, and to certain examples. It is a worldview. It's not the best, it's not the worst, it's how they see it. And then I say, okay, we have limitations. Maybe we are relying too much on models. Then I explain to them what is a model. So assuming they don't know what it is, they never took Econ A levels. So we use models as representations. Normally they're mathematical and they explain certain conditions, but they are limited. But we have to understand them to be able to criticize them, right? So I give that short introduction on history. Then we go through the neoclassical stuff if needed. Then normally what I do is, if we go through a model, then we explain, okay, this is the model. We do the maths. Everybody understood? Yes, great. Technical questions about, the derivations of this or that? No? Okay. Now let's stop for a second. And then I like to have at least a 5-minute discussion. Then I ask my students, okay, what do you think about this? Do you think this is useful? Do you think this is nonsense? What are the limitations? Do we see this applying in reality? How would you improve it? Would you throw it away? So I try to tease students for them to be able to reflect on the limitations of it. Some of them know already that I am critical, but I try to step back and give them the opportunity for they to be able to discuss, rather than just sinking all in of whatever I say. Then if I have more time, then I try to show them other approaches. So for instance, this is a neoclassical model and how they understand it. This is a, let's say, post-Keynesian model. This is how they understand it. This is a, whatever, depending, could be neo-Schumpeterian, could be neo-Marxist, could be Sraffian. This is how they understand it. And then I like to give the compare and contrast view as well, because the assumptions are different. Certain conditions could be different. They may reach even similar conclusions, or they might criticize something else entirely. So I like to play that around. It all depends on how much time you have, but at least a very quick discussion on the models, I think that's super important, even if it's 5 minutes.
That sounds like a really good method, actually. Basically, letting the students kind of make up their own minds and giving them some qualifiers and perspective, and then prompting them to reflect. One question I have is, given we've just discussed the focus on grades. Are they interested in doing that? Is it like kind of a small contingent of students that you end up speaking to? Are a lot of them just kind of, teach me the maths and don't give me all this other nonsense reflection?
It's a mixed bag, but I think most of them are interested. I see students, especially in the first year, because they come from a very different system at school, so they are a bit afraid to speak up individually. I don't want to put them under the spotlight. They may feel a bit uncomfortable. So if it's a more substantial discussion, then I just try to put them in groups. Or if I feel that it's a more, let's say, complex question, and clearly they're not comfortable in just raising their hand and speaking up, I use like those poll apps, like Pollev or Mentimeter. So I just, using your phone, this is the question, just type. It's anonymous. Type your question, type what you think. And then somebody puts something on the screen. So, I think this is bonkers because, this, and this. And then maybe one student says, well, yeah, I agree with that. Or no, that person is wrong because of that. So there are some certain techniques that you can use in the classroom to at least tease the students up a little bit. In history of economic thought, which is something I teach as well, because it's a more critical and history-based course, I like to play around with students. Like we start, let's say, with Adam Smith, who is normally the bread and butter. And then we go into criticisms to him. So I bring women political economists in the 18th and 19th century who were criticizing Smith. And then I say, okay, what do you think? Do you agree with them? Because one of them says, well, Smith actually only talks about men in the economy, never about the women. And then this generates, like a simple question, generates so much discussion. So I think most of them are interested. And what I feel with economics education, and this is why, again, we have to unlearn economics, I feel this indoctrination kind of removes the critical interest and the critical thrive that students have when they arrive on their first year. Slowly, we start to kill them with all the metrics, all the technical stuff, because a normal degree would have introductory, intermediate, and advanced, macro econometrics, some mathematics, maybe a course on development or behavioral or environmental economics, and that's it. So if maybe we would remove at least part of that, remove advanced. Do they need to repeat utility theory for 3 years? Make that optional and then give them other stuff to do.
I mean, it's quite sad, really, because when I listen to you, it's quite unusual for an economist to have thought so much about teaching and how to teach. So this is something we kind of touched on it when I read out those quotes from that quote from Sargent, right? But I mean, there's another quote I've got written down here, which is from your paper. So it says, all of the focus in our graduate instruction is on mastering the details of the discipline itself. And then we just hope that once you're put in front of a group of students, you can somehow transmit relevant information to them. That seems an odd posture to strike when you think about it. And so this actually, it does go across academia to some extent, this. But economists aren't trained as teachers and they don't think about how to teach. That's remarkable.
I completely agree. It is shocking. And maybe we have to rethink the whole university, higher education, and academia. All those systems we have to rethink, because we assume that teaching, we are very much used to this teaching, research, and extension model. It's very Humboldtian, very 19th century German education, right? With the free universities, which assumes that teaching, research, and applying that to outside the extension part of it, applying outside the university, all comes together. But clearly, because research has so much social status, and this idea of holding truths and the ivory tower and trying to influence society, trying to produce good and better science, it is so strong that the other aspects of it are actually neglected. I mean, you do a 3-year PhD, most PhD students have never taught a class before. You are not properly trained on pedagogical practices, on basic higher education training. Not ever. In the UK, this is only starting to be a requirement. So in most universities now, if you're going into a lectureship, you have to take a 1-year course on higher education teaching. But it still is baby steps. Honestly,
I've done some of these courses, and
most people are like, "Oh, this
minimal.
is useless, a waste of time." Because you're taking with people, like I took mine with people from other disciplines that do it in a completely different way. So you don't actually really relate. You do some general education stuff, which is okay, it's interesting. I enjoy it, but it is presented in a way that you just think, okay, this is a waste of time. How is this applicable to economics? No freaking idea. So so for instance, the economics network in the UK, they do some of that. So how can we provide training for economists to be able to educate better, or at least to think about the practice, to be able to do critical and liberal education, to have this wide variety of techniques, like I said, the coaching technique. So I'm just a coach. I'm going to step back and leave you to discuss, and I'm just going to guide. So all of that it's a shame, but it's really ignored in economics.
Yeah, no, it is a massive shame. So one thing I wanna talk about as well are some of the changes, right? And somebody was asking about this in chat, and you said earlier that you don't think the changes are enough. And there are two things I want to talk about, probably one at a time. And the first one is econometrics, and the second one is the core curriculum. So econometrics, now you said, somewhat unusually, I have to say, I haven't heard this opinion before, that econometrics should be curbed in economics degrees. And what I see a lot of in terms of the debates about whether economics is any good, a lot of the people who defend it will defend it no longer by saying all of this mathematical theory is good. What they'll say is we've moved away from it and we now use evidence. And so there's like Angrist and Pishk in particular, right? Their textbooks and their paper in the AER, or is it the JEL? I can't remember. Their review of empirical techniques. And they're basically saying, now we look at evidence, now we look at data, now we're falsifying the theories, look at the evidence on the minimum wage and the Econ 101 model of the labour market. And so is that not good stuff that we want to teach to our students more?
Okay. Yeah, interesting question. So I mentioned econometrics. Okay, maybe we should reduce that. That's what I said. I'm not saying that we should remove it from the degree. I think we should give the opportunities to students to choose. So we give them the foundations of it. So I think they have to know some statistics. They have to know some stats. They have to know some basic econometrics. They have to learn basic coding skills. They have to learn some mathematics. They have to. I have my own criticisms to it, etc. But I think you have to know that. Like, that's basic education. You would have to learn it in other disciplines. So you have to learn it. My problem with it is after you reach, let's say, the intermediate level, you are on how it is today. You have to do econometrics. You are forced to do. So if you want to do, let's say, a dissertation in your undergraduate, normally you are expected to only use econometrics. So is this desirable? I don't think it is. So I think students should be given the option. And if they want to actually specialize and go way advanced, then they can be offered a course, but that could be optional. So I think they could learn up to like an intermediate level, and then they choose if they want to follow that or not. Or if they want to do more applied stuff focused in one area, then they can go into complexity, or they go into behavioral or applied micro, but they are given the option.
I think I think it might have been Steve Keen actually, who made a suggestion to me, which my heart says it's a horrible elitist suggestion, but my head says it could make some sense, which is that basically you forget more or less about a lot of the technical aspects of economics in undergraduate. Now, not entirely, like you said, you got to introduce the ideas, and maybe in like final year you might have some classes on for people who want to pursue that. But basically it's much less technical. So that would include econometrics as well as like mathematics, right? So you forget about those things mostly for undergraduate, and then you have them as master's degrees, right, called economic modeling or called econometrics. And there, you know, if somebody wants to learn how to, you know, do econometrics or to do economic modeling, then they'll get a bloody, you know, intense education in it through those. So I mean, that sounds like it might be kind of in line with what you were saying. I'm still, I feel bad about that, but I think it's a good idea.
I think it makes sense because assuming that we have the limitation of a 3-year degree, and there's only how much you can cover in 11 weeks, and it's very assessment heavy. So I think going by topic and doing the inductive process that you said. So, okay, here's a bunch of data, raw data. Let's just get some basic tools and start to manipulate this. Then we can draw some conclusions, and then you kind of build up from examples, or you take a paper and then, okay, let's see how they do it. And then you try to expand on that and replicate. And then if you want the nitty-gritty, the technical part of it, just the pure theory, then it could be on a master's, or it could be on an optional like economic theory course. That could be an option. Yeah.
It's worth thinking about anyway. There might be some issues with kind of prestige and the people who've done the technical course being considered the real economists or something like that. But anyway, there's one more thing. So do we have you for like, I don't know, 20 more minutes? Are you able to stay for that?
Course.
Great. Because people have some questions in chat. But before we go to questions in chat, I want to, so please post your questions in chat, by the way, while we're doing this question, everybody.
I'm so happy people did not leave when I mentioned Foucault.
No, they didn't. It's hovered around 100 pretty consistently, to be honest. Even through the Foucault bit. Some people do know about Foucault actually in the chat. They were discussing it. It was interesting. Anyway, so the core curriculum. So is core anything like the change we want to see in economics? So just for background, everybody, Core is an online textbook. It's free. You can go on core-econ.org and just get access to it. It aims to address a lot of the criticisms of economics education, like the ones we've raised. And it starts with some history. It has some data. It presents some different ideas. It gets some things right, like, for example, how the banking system works that economics textbooks have traditionally got wrong. So I see it as something of an improvement. What do you think?
Okay, I have to make a disclaimer because I teach with Core in my departments. My department has been quite heavily involved in the creation of Core. And there is a huge debate amongst economists in the UK if Core is good or bad, or should we use it or not. So I'm going to give my 2 cents as my view to it. I think it is an improvement compared to standard neoclassical old textbooks. So like you've mentioned, I think there are some good examples on the banking system. I quite like how they approach, let's say, the labor market and inflation as a relationship of conflict. So it's very Kaleckian. So, you know, the labor market is composed by workers and firms and the capitalists, and they bargain. So there's a power relationship there. Inflation is caused by that relationship of power. So they use a lot of game theory to try to understand social interactions. So I think on that is a great improvement. Like finally, inflation is not just, you know, increasing money supply, or is an issue of issuing more money and problem with disequilibrium in the money market or whatever. So I think that's good. Those are improvements.
It's definitely an anti-Chicago boy education, isn't it? I don't think you could come out and be like, yeah, we're going to impose the kind of policies they did in Chile.
Yeah, no, they are critical. So they present certain things. You can see that they're quite balanced, and they try to be quite careful. So they said, okay, maybe in Chile this was implemented, but we know it has issues, or there is a lot of criticism to it, and then they explain it a little bit what happens. So, or there's like, okay, there are debates on how we understand, let's say, expectations and how it affects economic crises, for instance. So I think that's nice. So it is definitely an improvement, because I have never seen that in a normal textbook. My issues with core are the following. So I think that's an improvement. I don't think that's a revolution of how we teach economics. So it is an improvement, but it's still within what we can call the mainstream neoclassical umbrella, because it still assumes, let's say, income substitution effects in micro. It still assumes and gives a lot of weight to utility theory and optimization and constrained optimization. Everything is constrained optimization. I think that's a problem. So like the core tenets of neoclassical economics, most of the times they're still there. So I think that's an issue.
And sometimes they're implicit, right, as well, rather than explicit. So it's like, okay, maybe you're not doing all of the axioms of consumer theory, but there's a whole, I mean, it's like the free economics thing, right? It's like the people respond to incentives type framework, and it's like focused on individuals and focused on economic incentives and interactions between people, game theory, like you said, right? So it's still, it may not be explicit, but it is that kind of neoclassical.
It is, yeah. So, which is not, I'm not saying it's 100% wrong. It is very useful for certain examples and context. But because they lend a lot of weight into this, it seems that we all use that sort of decision making all the time, and that's not the case. So, for instance, I think game theory would be much more useful. So the way that they use game theory in terms of social interactions and bargaining and thinking about how firms or individuals interact, I think that's more useful than constraint optimization. So that's one thing. The other thing, which is my impression, my personal view, I think that because core has this sort of softening the edges approach, so they incorporate some concepts, but they maintain the neoclassical foundations kind of untouched. It seems that they're trying to please both sides. So they go to the more critical, heterodox, rebel economists and say, oh, we've added all of the stuff that you've mentioned. We've added Marx in a box here. We've added conflict. We've added social class.
The boxes are very visible. Yeah. Here it is for a box. 3 paragraphs, and then that's it.
Okay, done. Yeah, we've covered that. And then they go to the more mainstream standard economists and say, no, we didn't touch on utility. We didn't touch on optimization. No, we didn't touch on, basic macro. No, it's all here. Don't worry. And then it becomes a bit of a Frankenstein sometimes, because it is impossible for you not to teach that and engage in critical discussions with students, or still be able to criticize some of the models or some of the conclusions that you come up is like, okay, this is a bit confusing. Can I just assume a basic neoclassical model, or am I going a more critical route? So it's still, I think there are some things which is clearly still under construction. And I think at some point it has to take a stance. Either is a more standard econ book or is a more critical book. So I think it's still a bit fuzzy for me, whether it's one or the other.
Yeah, it's interesting because they do, yeah, they're trying to appease all sides, I think, and they called it, they weren't calling it plural. In fact, they were pretty adamant that it wasn't pluralist originally, that it didn't contain multiple perspectives. Then they started calling it pluralist, and there was that article in the Journal of Economic Literature by Wendy Carlin and Sam Bowles where they talked about pluralism and the type of pluralism that they have in core, and their example was actually Marx, but they seem to interpret Marx as something like shirking theory, which is where employees have to be observed, otherwise they won't be productive, and so they get paid more in order to make them productive. Now, I might be misremembering that a little bit, but the bottom line is I remember them just absolutely butchering Marx, right? And I'm not like a Marxist purist, but this was like, it's not about like contract frictions Marxism. You know what I mean? It is really, there's a really, really reductionist way to think about it. And not just reductionist, it's just wrong. So if that was their version of pluralism, then I'm not too happy with it. But I'm, I do also think that Core's a massive improvement over, for example, Mankiw. Like, it's worth saying. I mean,
oh my gosh, yes.
yeah, like, and Mankiw himself has been replaced, hasn't he, as the Harvard introductory economics teacher. It's now Raj Shetty and someone else who's, probably kind of similar to Core, a bit more empirical, probably a bit less dogmatic, but still probably fundamentally pretty neoclassical. But anyway, so let's move on to the questions. So one question we've had a few times from different people is, for the people watching, and there are many of them, probably most people watching, they haven't done an economics degree and they're probably not going to do one. How's the best way for them to self-educate in economics?
Oh, good question. So I think, the first thing is, what are you interested in knowing? What do you think economics is? This is what I would go, like, normally some people ask me, oh, I'm not an economist, but I want to know a little bit. Then, okay, I ask, okay, what are your main interests? Is it more like money and banking, or macro, understanding whatever's on the newspaper, inflation? Or are you more interested in history, economic history, or history of ideas? So I think the main initial step is to find out, okay, what do you actually want to know? Because economics, it's such a big umbrella. It has so much. Then I recommend a few books for reading. So one of the books that I recommend is Ha-Joon Chang's Economics, the User's Guide. So I think that's a basic, okay, want to know a little bit more what's behind economics and what is here, maybe go into that. If people enjoy more, let's say, history, depending how much they know, then I would recommend something a bit more deep, like Heilbronner or Karl Polanyi, who's super famous in sociology, or like a rereading of those books. If they're more interested in economic crises, I go for Hyman Minsky, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. I think that's super interesting. It's quite of a deep, dense reading, but I think that's quite good as well. So, or if they're more interested in like stuff that we're talking about here, so the state of economics under pressure, what happens if with the system that we cannot democratize economics, then I recommend like the Econocracy book, how we should democratize and what are the problems of not democratizing economics education, what are the issues with it. And I'm very happy to see over the past few years so many books for general readership on economics coming out and being published on, introducing economics for a layperson, or discussing key issues that we talk about, or more critical economics. So I'm more than happy to give other suggestions, but normally these are the books that I suggest.
Those are great suggestions. I always recommend Ha-Joon Chang. Heilbronner, The Worldly Philosophers, is a great introduction to the history of thought as well. Polanyi, while I like him, it wouldn't be the first book I read. Or even, in fact, I read it for the first time recently, and I did actually, I have to say, I struggled a bit. So, I don't know, maybe a reader of Polanyi or something like that. But there
are many online.
So valuable in terms of understanding the relationship between, the social and the economic, which is something that we've discussed, right, and which Foucault was interested in. So, another question, a very, very different question, by the way. Guilherme Marques, but I've butchered that name for sure. What do you think of attempts to organize alternative modes of production to capitalism, such as in Chile before Pinochet, or others?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. What do you think of attempts to organize alternative modes of production to capitalism, such as in Chile before Pinochet, or any others?
Yeah. Ooh. Let me think about it. Of course, I'm going to say I agree with that. Like, that's desirable. That's how we should think, because if history can teach us one thing, is that capitalism is not going to be here forever, right? Modes of production, they change throughout time. So of course we're going to move to something else after capitalism, and this is going to come up from somebody and somewhere, right? Like capitalism did. So I think that's natural, and that's how it should be, and that's the way to go. My only concern is I'm also very aware and a bit more, let's say, skeptical on how much they can go to that, because I think we're living in a moment where we can see a clear tension. Are we going to see some sort of rupture and capitalism is actually starting to move and change into something else? Or are we actually still trying to grasp and maintain the structures that we have? And I think this is what happens with countries that are on the periphery, that do not have so much power to make their change, and they're still very dependent on so many aspects, and they try to implement something different. So I'm quite skeptical that, or at least I think if change may come, it needs to be more of an organized movement, as more than one country. It has to come up in several places, and it needs to be this sort of force that is pushing against capitalism. Otherwise, it's just going to be repressed, because I don't think, and this is the side of me that likes conspiracy theory, I don't think that we are, I think there are so many interests that don't want to see capitalism to die. Like the system that we live today, especially in the global north, like nobody wants capitalism to die, or at least some people in power, or the big corp. Capitalism is great for them. Why should it move into something else? So I think for capitalism, so to set up alternative modes of production, either it's going to come as the sort of small adjustments. So good question on Chile. So like Chile now has a new government, and they're trying to make small adjustments on that. So once they got into power, they said, we're not going to try to please and calm down the markets. They said, okay, we're not going to be 100% radical. We're making small adjustments. So either it might be something like that, or a more organized movement with more than one country that is going to implement that change, and then something bigger will happen.
That's a really comprehensive answer.
Yes.
Thank you. So Ants asks, I think I know the answer to this, is reading Marx useful for understanding economics?
Oh, okay. I might surprise you with the answer.
Okay.
I think it is useful if you have the time to read the original, yes, but I'm also aware that reading the original Marx is a hell lot of work, and it's very difficult, and it might put you off. So I would say you can give it a try to go and see what the original says. So before Marx Capital, there is a way smaller book called The Critique to Political Economy, which Marx kind of summarizes his main criticisms to economics and what he thinks is the way to go. So you might want to check that. It's open access online. You can just read it online. But if that's too hard for you, then there's so many, let's say, rereadings of Marx, or like Marx in a nutshell, that could be useful, just so you can get a grasp of what people say about him. Because I know, and I see that with my students, is reading the original is very painful. You're not going to get it right or it's not going to come up easily. It takes a while for you to absorb all the ideas.
It's quite an endeavour, and it's one that I have to admit that I've never managed to finish. Radical asks, have the works of Marx and Keynes been synthesized? I can try and answer that, and you can pitch in, Danny, if you want. In one way, not really, but in another sense, yes. He's called Michael Kolechki, right? That would be like what I consider a blend between Marx and Keynes.
Yeah, Kalecki is a good one. So he was also in Cambridge during the time that Keynes was there. There are two others who are kind of in Keynes's little group, which also had some interesting readings and shared some of Keynes's ideas, but trying to put into a Marxian twist, which was Piero Sraffa. But that's harder to read, I think. And Joan Robinson to some extent as well.
Yes, but
that's Kalecki or Kaletsky, how they say it's. I think it's super interesting because he really shows. So he has an interesting paper called "The Political Consequences of Full Employment," and how deep down capitalism or the system that we live doesn't want full employment because it has political tension. So the bargaining power that we were talking about. So he's great.
Yeah, and that's super Marxist, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, actually, because Keynes, in the 1933 draft of the General Theory, Keynes actually cited Marx at one point, and the whole MCM production thing, but then he took it out because Keynes was quite an anti-communist, so he ended up offering a different critique of the economics of his time, the kind of free market economics that he disagreed with, but he wasn't prepared to use Marx for it in the final draft, which is interesting. Okay, so we have time for one more question. I have a couple of questions. Wait, no, this is only one question though, Radical. What are the type of tech challenges that large developing countries, such as Brazil or India, will face if they try to transition within a Green New Deal framework? Okay. I appreciate that's a very random question in a sense.
Green transition. That's an interesting point because I see the way I see the debate is like, okay, there are two views on this. One view, which is a more, let's say, positive, optimistic view, is like these countries are actually going to lead the green transition because they are these emerging powers that like let's say in the case of Brazil that I know a little bit more, so I can say something more sensible about it, I hope. So they can lead this transition because they rely on natural resources. They master some of the technologies that we consider to be more green, like generating green energy from hydroelectrics or being able to, compensate with carbon emissions. So they master some of those technologies, like a green fuel, like ethanol, to put in your car rather than petrol. So some people say, okay, they can help with the green transition, at least in some aspects. And this could be a potential comparative advantage to these countries. So they could specialize and focus and lead on that. That's one view. At the same time, like in the case of Brazil, so for instance, agribusiness is huge. And there are so many interests in not losing that power because it generates money, right? It's good for so many jobs, it's good for so many firms. A lot of people make money out of this, but it's not necessarily sustainable, right? I mean, you don't want to, deforest half of the Amazon to put cattle or soybeans. So I take both sides with a pinch of salt. I think there are some good opportunities there, but I think that we're only going to be able to, make something happen if we challenge this current system. And the problem is I don't really see why. I don't see who's going to challenge the current structures. Who's going to challenge the agribusiness when, Latin America and countries in Africa or Asia, they're supplying so much agricultural products, commodities, and everything that other countries need. So I don't know. I'm a bit more skeptical on that, probably.
Okay, thank you. So we're finishing on a nice pessimistic note there.
No, let's finish this on a great way. I think economics is changing.
Yep.
Small bits, but I would say, so I started my degree in 2007, just before the financial crisis. And when it happened, and we started to actually talk about these things, I think it was this sort of breath of fresh air that came. And we are having this discussion because we're putting things into perspective. And looking back, we have made some changes. So I think for the future, assuming that, okay, we are maybe a small minority that thinks that we have to unlearn economics, but we are a growing minority. And I think continuing this project is going to actually make some change deep down in the future, because ideas change, theories change, and to a certain point, a new paradigm will come. So I think we're doing a good job here to finish on a more
that was a very, very nice optimistic note. So thank you so much for coming on the stream.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
No, it's been really interesting to talk to you, and thanks to everybody in chat as well for some interesting discussions and interesting questions. So I'll see you all soon.